For new and intermediate chess players, I've put together the top 10 strategies and tactics that you need to know to start winning more games. These core strategic principles and tactics will help you understand what you're trying to accomplish and how to do it. This is Legendary Tactics. This compact guide will offer you all the essential ideas you need if you're trying to get better at chess. Let's start with the early game. Number 1. There are innumerable different openings to choose from. However, there are certainly some openings that are better than others. The opening you decide to use will depend heavily on your own playstyle. Are you more offensive or defensive? Do you prefer a traditional memorized sequence of opening moves, or would you rather destabilize your opponent with an untraditional opening? If you're looking for a standard opening that offers lots of options with a slightly more aggressive start, then I suggest pawn e2 to e4. Your opponent will likely respond with their pawn to e5 or perhaps a knight move, and you now have room for your queen, your bishop, and your knight to enter play and to begin development, and that's really one of the ultimate early goals. And if you don't believe me about this move, ask either Bobby Fischer or Garry Kasparov. It's the moves they love. A second good option is pawn d2 to d4. Many of you will recognize this as the opening to the Queen's Gambit. I'll put a link to my video on that opening at the top. While it doesn't open the game up quite as quickly as e4, the d4 opening will lead to a more positional game. Chess is such an incredibly interesting game because there are hundreds of viable openings. You just need to find the right opening against the opponent you're facing. Number 2, strategic goals. While tactics on the board are really important, and by tactics I mean the individual moves that you make, either threatening or responding to your opponent, your universal goals or your overall strategic endeavors should influence your early game quite a bit. And the main goals you should be thinking about are 1. Developing your pieces or getting them into play more quickly than your opponent. A rook who's stuck in the corner of the board is very ineffective. If you manage to get a queen to the center of the board, remember she has influence over the whole board. That can be devastating to your opponent. Offering defense to your king with a maneuver such as castling is another objective you should think about before you begin launching attacks. And this can be achieved with the king's Indian defense as well. The most important strategic principle, though, in chess is arguably winning control over the center of the board. One way to do this is by moving a pawn to a3 early on, and this move allows your knight to move to c3, who can then help you win control of the center square, and they're not under major attack then from the opposing bishop. To illustrate the importance of controlling the center, a knight in the middle of the board can threaten 8 squares, as opposed to its starting position where it only threatens 2. This is great for both offense and defense, and also unexpected attacks. Likewise, pawns in the middle of the board are much more valuable than ones on the flank, especially if they're supporting each other. So as a general rule, try to get your pieces towards the center of the board where they're most effective, and try not to lose the middle 2 pawns. Those are the 2 most important pawns in the game. Better to trade off your outside pawns for the opponent's middle pawns to open up weaknesses in their lines. Number 3, offense versus defense. Bobby Fischer said that chess is a matter of delicate judgment, knowing when to punch and how to duck. And while the early game is very much about establishing your position on the board and also reading your opponent, you need to be aware of the 2 major styles of chess play: offensive and defensive. Both approaches can work, but using the right style at the right time is what distinguishes high-level players from novices. Offensive play is characterized by someone who moves their pieces out aggressively and launches many attacks and will use quick piece mobilization and more rapid gambits. Defensive play is more focused on creating fortresses and setting traps and protecting your pieces. For example, this may be a slower moving pawn march and knight positioning and castling. If you find yourself up against a particularly strong player, you may need to give them some room to make a mistake before you can actually take the offensive. The key is to know when to play offense and when to play defense, and this will depend on whether you have initiative or not. Initiative is the player who is the one who's creating threats or who is one move ahead at the start of the game. This will likely be the white player, but as Bobby Fischer said, when he started playing chess effectively, it was when he realized that he needed to play black to win. So if you find yourself having the best piece development as well as the initiative, that's the time to attack. Be sure to attack with a plan. If you have control over the center of the board, you'll likely be in a good position to attack with support. A lone piece, such as a queen overextended into your opponent's territory, will do little for you, and you'll end up dancing that piece around and not developing your forces. And this will likely end up retreating multiple times while your opponent is developing their pawns and knights. This can be really ineffective for you. So coordinate your attacks with multiple pieces in play and focus on squares that don't have well-entrenched support networks. On the flip side, if your opponent has the initiative, it's essential that you watch where future attacks are likely to come from and to preempt those with counter moves that make them impractical. We're moving into the mid-game now, and the mid-game roughly describes the point in the game after which both players have developed most of their pieces, and they've given their king a modicum of protection. This is when you need to know how to capture your opponent's pieces. Two of the foundational and most essential attacks in chess are the double attack and the fork. You should use both of them. First, a double attack is when you move a piece to create two simultaneous threats against your opponent. It doesn't necessarily have to be on two pieces. It can be on a particular square that might lead to a positional advantage. So for instance, your queen might threaten their bishop, but also threaten to move to an empty space that would result in checkmate. Next is the fork, and that's an attack where you directly threaten two different pieces at the same time, and you force the player to choose which one to defend or escape. You can often surprise your opponent using a knight to set these up. Both of these are powerful ways to force your opponent to make difficult decisions. If you know someone who's trying to get better at chess, please consider sharing this guide with them so they have some ideas to consider. The mid-game, number 5, discovered attacks. One really important piece of advice that you should heed is to always ask yourself why a player made a particular move. Are they threatening a piece? Are they setting up to threaten a piece or to lay a trap? Or, more importantly, have they opened up a discovered attack? This is when you move one piece, such as a knight, that allows another piece behind it, such as a bishop, on your back line to now threaten an opposing piece. The piece you move may also threaten an opposing piece as well. You won't always notice these subtle attacks immediately unless you train yourself to watch for them. A player needs to have strong board awareness to avoid falling victim to these types of attacks. Even more deadly is if a discovered attack is also a discovered check. This forces your opponent to save the king and lose material. Number 6, power pieces. As the game develops, some pieces become stronger and stronger. In the late game, rooks are arguably the second most powerful piece. In the early game, they're quite weak because they're poorly positioned and they can't take advantage of a busy board. They're trapped behind the pawns. So once you start to get into the endgame position, look for open files and ranks and try to join or link your rooks together. When they work in tandem, especially in the same lanes, rooks become incredibly strong. So work towards pairing your rooks to cover each other in both open or semi-open files and ranks. In the endgame, they're great units to help pawns advance and to promote safely, and they're also useful for cutting off the opponent's king from entering the fight. Just be sure to avoid getting stuck between locked down pawn structures. Number 7, pins and skewers. There are two other types of attack that you need to make use of, and that's pins and skewers. They can only be accomplished with long-range pieces, which include queens, rooks, and bishops. A pin is a position whereby a piece is under attack and held in place because if it were to move, it would give up a more valuable piece behind it. In the case of a king, the pinned piece is not legally allowed to move if the king is at risk. So this is called an absolute pin. Pins are a great tool to limit what your opponent can do and are probably one of the most common tools that chess players use to gain advantage. A skewer is a more deadly attack on two pieces that are lined up, one with another, but in this case the more valuable piece is under direct threat in the front. Watch for opportunities to set up these attacks with your queens, rooks, and bishops. If you've gotten value from these ideas, please subscribe to Legendary Tactics now and like the video if you want to help us out. Number 8. Pawns in the endgame. Not all games actually have an endgame because the game can end prematurely, but you'll know you've entered the final stages of the game if pawns begin moving towards promotion and when there are only a handful of pieces left on a much more open board. In this stage of the game, don't underestimate the value of pawns. Like the king and the rooks, they're sometimes limited in power early on, but they can grow in power as the game progresses. Late game pawns can be game-changing as they can win you valuable material or they can be promoted to win the game. However, your pawns are only as strong as their positioning. So there are times when they're weak, and that's when they're 1, isolated, 2, stacked one in front of the other, or 3, backwards. As you can see, backwards pawns are the ones that can't be defended or advanced and will likely become the target of your opponent's attacks. Once they've taken them out, they'll take all the rest out too. So avoid weak pawn position because you'll end up tying down other powerful pieces who are forced to defend your outlying pawns. Usually the player who can promote the first pawn is also the one who wins the game, so find a path to get your pawn through. Number 9, sacrifice. When you reach the endgame, take stock of your strengths and weaknesses to help inform what strategy you'll use. If you're the player with more material left, then you should force your opponent to exchange material other than pawns. So trading rooks, bishops, queens, and knights is wise if you're ahead. And by the same logic, if you find yourself down on material, try to avoid trades because they severely limit your ability to respond to threats. I'd also advise that you rethink the value of the pieces in the endgame. So for example, offering up a queen in the late game or a rook for an advantageous position that leads to a checkmate is often a temptation that your opponent can't pass up. Number 10, aggressive kings. At the end of the game, every single move matters and there's no room for mistakes. Like the rook, who's weaker in the early game and very strong in the late game, endgames also favor aggressive kings. Don't be afraid to get your king into the fight and use him to protect and advance pawns. To play the king effectively, you need to math out your play as many moves in advance as possible. With fewer pieces on the board, you can more accurately predict your opponent's moves, and you can force certain outcomes. For example, one principle that you need to know if you're attempting to mate your opponent with, say, a knight and a bishop, is to force the king into the corner box that shares the same color that your bishop is on. They'll, of course, make a beeline for the color that does not relate to your own bishop. There are so many different possible endgame matchups that I can't cover them all, but remember that having initiative is even more important in the late game, and you can often win the initiative with smart king play. I hope this advice has been helpful to you, and remember that every grandmaster was once a beginner. So good luck improving your chess game, and thanks so much for your time.